Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan with video number 27 in my series on classical harmony and counterpoint. This is one of those lessons where I talk about one chord, hopefully not for too long. Today that chord is passing 5-6 in major keys. And I want to start with a little experiment. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a composer from Mozart's time. And imagine your job is to harmonize a bass line that's just a rising major scale. You've got to put one chord above every bass note, and it has to make sense to someone living in 18th century Europe. Could you do it? I want you to actually think about this for a second, so I'll just wait. If you've watched all my videos, this should be easy, because you can do it using only chords from the Big 18. By now, we've seen bass lines rise from 1 to 5 at least a half dozen times, and they pretty much always do the same thing. They start on tonic, they pass through some chord with a dominant function to 1-6, and then move to a predominant, and finally, a dominant. And the chords might not be the exact ones I'm using here, but they'll be pretty similar, right? 2-6 could be 2-6-5, and so on. And then to get from scale degree 5 up to tonic, we'd resolve that dominant deceptively to a 6 chord, then on to some kind of dominant function chord above the leading tone, and finally back to tonic. The whole thing sounds like this. Now, I didn't pull this exercise out of thin air. If you were a young composer or continuo player back in Mozart's time, this is one of the first things you'd learn. And it's a useful skill because bass lines move around by step all the time and the harmonies are pretty predictable. But as you probably know, bass lines don't just go up, so those young composers would have to do the same thing with a bass line that goes down as well. Let's put one of those on screen, and once again, I want you to take a second to think about whether you could harmonize this with the chords and rules of progression that you know. I'll wait. Okay, my guess is that this one was trickier. The bottom half of the scale should be pretty easy. We know already that you can walk from scale degree 5 down to 1 using only tonic and dominant harmonies. But the top half has a curveball in it. We start on tonic, and then the bass steps down to scale degree 7. But from there, we have to get the bass down to scale degree 6. And this is a problem because so far we've only seen scale degree 7 go up when it's in the bass. It's the leading tone. As far as we know, that's what it's supposed to do. So at this point in the series, we don't have a chord that could go above that note. Effectively, we're stuck above scale degree 7 for the rest of our lives. Now, I suppose if you were inclined to cheat, you might ask, well, what if we just didn't put a new chord above scale degree 7? Then it could just be a passing tone taking us down to scale degree 6. Sure, that's definitely a thing. In fact, we see it in one of the most famous descending bass lines of all time, the Air from Bach's Third Orchestral Suite. The chords here are tonic, 6 as a bridging chord, and then that 4, sharp 4, 5 bass line we saw so many times in video 26, which we now know will have a diatonic predominant, an applied chord to 5, and then the dominant. Now, notice here that the first 3 chord roots, which are all in the bass, are spaced in thirds. D goes down to B, which then goes down to G. Bach connects these with passing tones, non-chordal passing tones in the bass voice. So while he holds the opening D major, he walks the bass down to C sharp, which is not part of any chord, and then gets to B, which supports the 6th chord, and then walks the bass down again through another non-chord tone, this time scale degree 5, to get us to that G on the next downbeat. Here's what it sounds like. Now that's a lovely technique, but for our purposes, it's still cheating. Let's go back to our exercise. Remember that we need an actual chord to go above that scale degree 7 in the bass. And it turns out that chord is the so-called passing 5/6 chord. That's our topic today. It's spelled exactly like a chord we already know, but it behaves differently. Its bass note goes down rather than up. And really, that's why passing 5/6 exists. It allows our bass to step down from tonic to scale degree 6. Here is the bass pattern we're talking about. Functionally, it starts on tonic, then steps down to 5/6, but 5/6 has a passing function now, not a dominant function, and the reason is that scale degree 7 isn't acting like a leading tone here. Remember, the essence of dominant function is that energy that pulls the leading tone up to the tonic. But here, scale degree 7 is a bit more relaxed. It's happy to just step down smoothly to scale degree 6, which it turns out can support quite a few different chords and functions. We're going to focus on 3 in this video. Root position 6 as a bridging chord, 4/6 as a chord with a subdominant function, and any number of applied chords to 5. And then from scale degree 6, the bass usually continues going downward. Today we'll see it step down to scale degree 5, or leap down to 4, or even 3. So one last thing before we hear more music. The passing 5/6 belongs to a larger family I call non-functional passing chords. We're going to see more of these in the next 2 videos, and they all have a few things in common. Each has a bass note that's part of a passing motion. In other words, we can move in and out of that bass note by step in a single direction. And they can't usually be understood to have any of the 4 harmonic functions we know: tonic, predominant, dominant, or subdominant. But they all connect functional chords. Some connect chords that have the same function. Others, like this one, connect chords with different functions. Okay, now on to the examples. And we'll start with situations where the passing 5/6 leads into a root position 6 as a bridging chord. Here is the finale of Haydn's late C major piano trio. It goes by very quickly, but not so fast we can't hear a familiar design here. It's a parallel interrupted period with a 4-bar antecedent that ends on a half cadence, and a 4-bar consequent ending on a PAC. Now I'm going to play it again, and this time I want you to follow the bass line specifically and see if you can find the passing 5/6 chord. We're in C major, so you want to listen for any stepwise line that goes down from the tonic. Let's focus on just the antecedent phrase for now. Hopefully you noticed that the bass line is built from 2 stepwise segments. The first goes 1, 7, 6, and then the second one goes 4, sharp 4, 5. I'd expect that the second one looks familiar by now because we saw it 6 times in the last video and once already today. It's a diatonic predominant, moving to an applied chord to 5, in this case 7 half diminished 7 of 5, and then finally into 5 for the half cadence. But in the first half of the phrase, we've got tonic in bar 1, 6 as a bridging chord in bar 2, and a passing 5/6 in between. To help you hear it, let me play it for you slowed down with an emphasis on the bass line. And now the whole period with the passing 5/6 in the first bar of the antecedent and in the consequent. Before we look at the next example, I want to remind you about something I said at the very end of video 21. Now and then, 6 can be used as a bridging chord to connect 1 with 1/6. It's a sort of old-fashioned progression, but it does stick around during the classical period, and it's the backbone of this beautiful phrase from Mozart's Gran Partita for winds. The lowest voice arpeggiates the chord, so there's only really 2 bass notes per bar. 1 goes down to 7, then to 6, and finally a leap to 3. In terms of actual chords, here are our 2 tonics, here is the bridging chord 6, and then here is the passing 5/6 that connects it to the opening tonic. This is how it sounds. Mozart seems to like using the passing 5/6 in these sorts of slow, dreamy melodies, because here's another one from the middle movement of his K332 piano sonata. This one uses 5/6 to pass down from tonic to 4/6, which has a subdominant function. And it's built as a slow sentence. Basic idea, continuation, with the lowest voice arpeggiating complete chords again. So the real bass line is on each quarter note beat. During the first listen, just follow that bass line, maybe want to sing along, and see if you can get a feel for the harmonies that are above. So you may have noticed that there's a passing 5/6 in the very first bar. This shouldn't be a surprise by now. We keep seeing that chord at the beginning of phrases because that's where bass lines are most likely to descend from tonic. You might also have noticed that the bass line in this whole first system is really similar to the one we heard in the last example. We start on tonic, we descend through 7 to 6, which eventually makes its way to a low scale degree 3, but this time we pass through scale degree 4 en route to that low 3. And once again, we've got tonic harmonies on the outside, the first of which moves through a passing 5/6 on its way to scale degree 6 in the bass. But this time, 6 is a 4/6 chord, which then switches to root position, making for a whole half bar of subdominant function. Here's how these two bars sound again. Now listen again to the whole thing. And in that second system, notice how Mozart echoes the last two bass notes we heard, E flat and D, in bar 3 before finally introducing the dominant harmony en route to that half cadence. Okay, 2 down, 1 to go. For the last use of passing 5/6, we need to tap into what we learned in video 26, because now 5/6 is going to pass downward into an applied chord to 5. Here are the first 4 bars of the aria that Bach uses as the basis of his Goldberg variations. This is actually the simplest bass line we've seen so far. He starts on tonic and then just goes down by step to 5. But this doesn't mean that the harmony is simple. When composers in this period march down from tonic to dominant, the third chord over scale degree 6 is usually an applied chord to 5. In this case, we've got tonic, passing 5/6, 7/6 of 5, and then 5. And just in case you're still fuzzy on what 7/6 of 5 means, let's go through the steps. The overall key is G, 5 of G is D, and in the key of D, the 7 diminished triad is C sharp diminished, spelled C sharp, E, and G. And to get this chord, Bach needs to raise scale degree 4 chromatically. There it is, C turned into C sharp, aka the local leading tone that resolves into the note D. Here's how it sounds. But that third chord isn't always 7/6 of 5. Here is the slow movement from Mozart's G major piano concerto. And once again, we see that simple stepwise bass, 1, 7, 6, 5. And of course, we start on tonic, go through passing 5/6, but the chord above scale degree 6 is kind of a weird one. It's 7 half diminished 6/5 of 5. I told you this chord wouldn't be inverted, but it occasionally is. So that's a half diminished 7th chord whose root is F sharp. Here's how it sounds. So at this point, we've come full circle. I started us off today with a problem to solve. How do we harmonize a descending major scale in the bass? And we discovered that while the second half was easy, we got stuck in the first half. Well, thanks to Bach and Mozart, now we know what chords to use over scale degrees 7 and 6. Over 7, we use a familiar chord, but now in a new role, the passing 5-6. And it passes to an applied chord to 5. In this one, I'll use 5-4-3 of 5. And here is how the whole thing sounds. Now, if you want to stick around for one more thing, I'm going to close the video with a teaser, because there's one use of passing 5-6 I haven't talked about here, because it falls under a bigger topic and really deserves its own video. But it's also maybe the most famous and most familiar use of passing 5-6, so I couldn't resist talking about it for just a second. Here is a short phrase for tenor and baritone from Mozart's Magic Flute. This is from the same quintet we actually heard in video 21. And notice before we listen that the bass voice is really just a descending scale that leads up to scale degree 5 at the end for a half cadence. Here's how it sounds. So we can tell even at a glance that Mozart's descending scale in the bass has different harmonies than the ones we learned today, because there's no chromatic notes. He doesn't have that applied chord to 5 that we needed over the third note. But before we analyze the actual chords, I want to show you something about how the passage is built. To start, I want to simplify the texture a bit. And I'm also not super interested in that last bar, which has just a run-of-the-mill dominant, tonic, dominant motion. What interests me are the first 3 bars. Take a look at bar 1. We start on a root position triad, and when the bass steps down, it moves to a 6-3 chord. So far, so good. But watch this. To get the second bar, we just copy over the contents of bar 1 and move everything down by third. And of course, this gives us another 5-3 chord and another 6-3. And then to get bar 3, we do the same thing again. Copy, paste, downshift, giving us a third pair. Here's how it sounds on the piano. And here's Mozart's version. Now, there's a special name for this kind of progression, one where we take a pair of chords and then copy it once or twice at different pitch levels. It's called a sequence, and they often end up using weird chords that we don't see elsewhere because the harmony isn't governed by function so much as it's governed by this mechanical copy and pasting technique. So you can get some familiar progressions, like in the first 3 chords here, but then oddball chords like 3-6, which you're just never going to see in a functional harmonic progression. But that's all I'm going to say about sequences today. We'll get to know them soon enough a few videos from now. Before then, though, we're going to learn about passing 5-6 in minor, which we typically find in a progression known as the lament bass. I'll see you then.